Thank you all very much for being here. This may be our largest crowd ever, and thank you for putting up with the seating arrangements and the parking arrangements and with me. I'm your ringmaster, Crosby Kemper, the director of the library, and I'm going to mention one upcoming program. I do have to, while I think about it, tell you two things. One, the library gates will be open when you come out. The library garage gates will be open. And two, Tom was in St. Louis last night where he had only 30 people. So. So I don't know how many of you are related to him or lived on Wenonga, but anyway, it's good that you're all here. So I do want to mention one upcoming program, which is upcoming tomorrow night. The library's been doing events on First Friday, sort of a family-friendly introduction to First Friday. We call it Art Starts at the Library. And we have a great exhibit that's up here on the second floor of the mezzanine called Things Fall Apart, an exhibit from the Smithsonian about the inner workings of everyday objects that have been disassembled. And it is a lot of fun. There are videos showing the assembly and disassembly and whatnot. And we'll have music by the Tiny Escalators. Believe it or not, yeah, absolutely. And Maker Fun and a cityscape visual tour up on the rooftop from our great architectural historian, Sid Milstein. So it will be a lot of fun. So now to introduce Tom. And this is the second time I've done this, third time he's been in the library, I believe. Also, we had a large crowd at the Plaza Library the last time when Listen Liberal was published. I told him I was going to do this. As many of you know, I lean to the right, and he, of course, leans to the left. And as I said in my introduction last time, I find an awful lot to agree with in his books. It makes me nervous. And I read his stuff. He's writing a lot for The Guardian these days, and I read his stuff. And he's been on tour, and he's been touring in the Midwest, and he's been to places like Marceline. You should read his column in The Guardian about going to Marceline, the home of Walt Disney, of course, and the trek from Walt Disney's father, who was a socialist, to Walt Disney, who was not a socialist. But I find a lot to agree with in Tom, and so I asked him if I could do this, and he said yes. So I'm going to tell you, I took my New York Review of Books to lunch today, which I do when the new New York Review comes out, and I saw that Christopher Browning had this article reviewing a relatively new biography of Hitler, and I was wondering whether I should read that book or not. So Christopher Browning, I own all his books. He's a great German historian. I thought I better read this and find out about the book, and it turned out that it is not so much a review of the book. In fact, it's not all a review of the book. It is a comparison of Hitler to Trump. Well, you see, some of you like that. I thought it was a little bit over the top. And so I went through it and I thought, what is he really saying? Because he agreed that Trump maybe didn't have a paramilitary that was kicking people in the street, and his background was a little different than Hitler's, and da-da-da-da-da. And so it really came down to Trump as a racist, and that really came down to Steve Bannon. And so I decided, I've never really looked up Steve Bannon. So I Googled Steve Bannon, and I found the famous Vatican speech. And you've probably heard about this Vatican speech, the culture war and whatnot. And I read the speech, and it's actually about crony capitalism. It's about the middle class being left behind by the elites who caused the crisis, the Great Recession, and rewarded themselves with bank bailouts. And I said, wait a minute, this sounds really, really familiar. And so I was going to do this, and I won't do this for you. I went to Listen Liberal, and sort of if you could Google this and you can find Steve Bannon's speech, and then you could go to page 143 through 147 of Listen Liberal, and you might just be surprised at how similar they are. And Tom and I talked about this, and I don't think he's going to disagree with this. Now, he will tell you about the differences he has with Steve Bannon, which are extreme and understandable. The point I want to make about this is we're rearranging the politics of this country as we speak. Things are very different in Washington and out here in the heart of the country. And one of the things we really need to do is listen carefully to each other and not make assumptions about each other. And I'm listening carefully to Tom Frank. I've been reading him over the years, What's the Matter with Kansas, which is about a lot of my right-wing friends here in Kansas City. And I learned things from him, and I learned, most of all, I learned that there are things we have to talk about that we agree on, and we need to do a lot more of that in this country. Well, Tom Frank, as you know, is from Kansas City. He grew up here. He went off to the wilds of places like the University of Chicago, et cetera. He's been a columnist for the Wall Street Journal. He was insufficiently left-wing for them. Thank you. Thank you. There was that split second, where you just didn't know. He's written for Harper's at length. Right now, he's writing a lot for The Guardian, the English newspaper with a very wide American audience, lots of podcasts and great stuff. And of course, he's one of our most profound critical voices in the United States today. And so it's a very great pleasure to have him back in the Kansas City Public Library.
Howdy, folks. Oh, that is loud. So how are y'all doing? What a beautiful day it is, by the way, in Kansas City. So this is the last stop for me on a very, very long book tour. And it was 14 stops in the Midwest. And before that, it was Scandinavia. And before that, it was Australia. And the whole world wants to know about what the hell is happening to us. So, let's talk about it. There's, by the way, what Mr. Kemper was saying, there's so many interesting angles to that. I live in Washington now, and the people I live among really have no idea how people live here in the Midwest. Not the faintest idea. We'll talk about that afterwards, okay? Remind me to come back to that, but what I want to start talking about is Trump. Specifically, the country that elected Donald Trump president. Okay, let's talk about this country that we live in. The last couple of years here in America have been a time of brisk prosperity, according to official measurements, with unemployment down and the stock market up. For Americans who work for a living, however, nothing ever seems to improve. Wages do not grow. Median household income is still well below where it was in 2007. The economists have a way of measuring this. They call it the labor share of the gross national product, as opposed to the share taken by stockholders. The labor share of the gross national product hit its lowest point since records were started in the year 2011. And then it stayed there right through the next couple of years. In the fall of 2014, with the stock market hitting all-time high, a poll showed that nearly 3/4 of the American public believed that the economy was still in recession, because for them, it was. Now, folks, there was a time when average Americans could be counted upon to know correctly whether the country was going up or going down, because in those days when America prospered, the American people prospered as well. But these days, things are different. Let's look at it in a statistical sense. First of all, I need to get some, yeah, thank you. I went to Winstead's this afternoon, and I ate and ate and ate and ate. Now, why did I do that? All right, so, okay, statistically, if you look at it from the middle of the 1930s up until the year 1980, so the Depression up to the year 1980, the lower 90% of the population in this country, we might call the American people, that group took home 70% of the growth in the country's income. If you look at the same numbers from 1997 up until now, from the height of the great dot-com bubble up to the present, and you find that this same group, the American people, pocketed none of this country's income growth at all. Our share of these great good times was zero, folks. The upper 10% of the population, by which I mean our country's financiers and managers and professionals, consumed the entire thing. To be a young person in America these days is to, I think, understand instinctively the downward slope that so many of us are on these days. College costs are out of control. You know this. The university where I got my PhD back in the 80s and 90s today costs nearly $65,000 a year to attend. You go there for 4 years, that's more than $250,000, folks. You want to go to a university like that, you got to take out a lot of loans. And as I travel this country, I am forever meeting young people who are $50,000, $60,000, $100,000 in debt, and they're just starting out life, folks. They're going out into this Uberized economy of ours with the equivalent of a mortgage and no house to show for it. Now, at the other end of the social ladder, of course, it is all upside all the time. Back in 1980, American CEOs made about 40 times as much as our average blue-collar line worker. Today, it's 373 times. One particularly lucky American family, in fact, has as much wealth as does 40% of the population put together. The main accomplishment of the 6 high-achieving members of this family was to inherit shares in Walmart, the retailer that has sucked the life out of thousands of towns in this part of the country. And that's where we are, folks, nearly 10 years now after the financial crisis. Growth that doesn't grow and prosperity that doesn't prosper. The country, I think people understand now, is simply no longer arranged in such a way as to make its citizens economically secure. And that's the country that elected Donald Trump president. What I am saying, folks, is that the middle class is disintegrating in the great middle class nation. And you know this is true. There is outrage and there is fury around every corner, and you just scratch the surface and it comes screaming out at you. Now, you would expect, I used to study history, that was my subject, and I would expect the developments that I just described would lead to a revival of left-wing politics. And the reason you'd expect that is because that's what happened last time around. And that's what happened in all similar times in history. You think about the 1890s, you think about the 1930s, and yet here's the fascinating thing. This is the thing that, well, I would say drives me crazy, but I write about it, and I write about it, and I write about it. I'm obsessed with it. This is what fascinates me. The politics of this age of inequality that we're living through right now are dominated by right-wing revolts that only accelerate the disintegration of the middle class. And it's Trump right now, but in truth, this is the 5th successful, 6th, depending on how you count it, 5th successful conservative uprising to happen in my lifetime. So I was born in 1965. Nixon came along in 68. You had the New Right, Ronald Reagan in the late 70s, Gingrich in the 90s, George W. Bush in the aughts, and the Tea Party movement shortly afterwards with Trump, trailing along behind. It just keeps chugging along. To understand how crazy it all is, I want to remind you of what things were like in the year 2009. And I'm going to come back to 2009 throughout tonight's talk, because I think that's a critical year in our stupid modern history. But this was 2009, the financial crisis had just happened, the Great Recession was underway, and it looked like at the time that the philosophy of free markets had been discredited for good. I mean, here we had deregulated Wall Street. We had got down on our knees and worshiped Wall Street. We had put nice, friendly Wall Streeters in charge of overseeing Wall Street, and here Wall Street goes and poisons the economy of the entire world with its mortgage-backed securities. And so it seemed in 2009 like we were at a historical turning point. Here, the Bush administration had blundered into a series of incredible disasters. The Iraq War, Hurricane Katrina, remember that one? The Jack Abramoff lobbying scandal, and then economic catastrophe on top of all that. And it felt like the last straw. This felt like we had come to the end. And I live in Washington these days, and the pundit class in Washington thought they understood what was happening back in 2009. They said that the tectonic plates were shifting, that conservatism's long reign was at an end. The age of Reagan was finally over. A historian wrote, the liberal age of Obama was dawning. The pendulum had swung one way, and now it was going to swing back the other by a force all of its own. We didn't have to do anything about it. That's just how history worked. So back in 2009, the pundits loved to talk about how the Republican Party was on what they called a political suicide mission, how its candidates had zero chance in the enlightened new America that we were living in. The Republican Party, they said, was being sent to the dustbin of history. The reason I bring it all up, you understand, of course, is because it's exactly the same thing that we heard all last year, with commentator after commentator telling us that Donald Trump didn't have a chance and that the Republicans had committed suicide by nominating him. Almost exactly the same. Anyhow, to get back to 2009, the Republicans at that time turned out to not be interested in their own demise. They didn't particularly want to go down that road. And they did exactly the opposite of what the Washington pundits were telling them they needed to do. They stepped on the gas instead of the brakes. Instead of moving to the center, by the way, which is what every pundit, this is how you get your pundit's license in DC. You understand that. You always have the same advice. Move to the center. You've always got to, everything is in the center. You got to always move to the center. That's always the answer, right? So instead of doing that, though, the Republicans did the opposite, and they purged their moderate wing. They responded to the failure of markets by becoming free market zealots. Do you remember this? Waving their copies of Ayn Rand. And then in 2010, this radicalized Republican Party scored its greatest victory in congressional elections in many decades. And they took some 600 seats from the Democrats at the state legislature level. And they purged countless Republican moderates. I remember in the Kansas legislature especially that was true. In 2014, they went on to conquer the Senate, and today the tragedy is complete. And they control Congress and the presidency, and Trump immediately got to name a justice to the Supreme Court. And they control the most state legislatures they have since the 1920s. Folks, this is a wipeout for the Democratic Party, and also for those pundits who have so persistently taken Democratic victory for granted. And all of this is going on, remember, while Wall Street loots the world and while the middle class of this nation falls apart. "12 years ago, I wrote a book about populist conservatism in Kansas, and I had a phrase in that book that I was proud of, where I said that in Kansas, the gravity of discontent pulls to the right and to the right and further to the right, okay? The gravity of discontent. And I meant to describe this as a kind of aberration. It's like, look at what is happening out here. Look at how, strange things are going on out here on the high plains, folks. Well, today the gravity of discontent works that way everywhere in this country. It works that way everywhere you go in the Western world. Now, why is that? To stick with our own country, the one very good reason is because the Republican Party here is extremely comfortable with the traditional language of populism, the language of class anger. Okay, the middle class is coming apart, and they pretend to speak or do speak to that anger, to that fury that I mentioned earlier. And they do this very naturally. It's second nature to them by this point. They rail against the elite and the rigged system, and they complain about the Hollywood millionaires. and the arrogant people who make our TV shows and the haughty professors who indoctrinate our students when we send them off to college. And they pretend to love what they call the real Americans who live in places like this one, the heartland. And this is interesting. They deliberately mimic left-wing protest movements from the days of yore. And that's what the Tea Party movement was, folks. A fake hard times protest movement, deliberately patterned after protest movements from the 1930s. Glenn Beck, remember this guy? Big guy in 2009. He was the man of the moment back then on the cover of Time magazine. He deliberately mimicked Martin Luther King's March on Washington. Paul Ryan, who's today's Speaker of the House, wrote an article in Forbes magazine that he called "Down with Big Business." And now comes Trump. I was at the Republican convention in Cleveland last July, and when they introduced Donald Trump for his big moment at the podium, they called him America's blue-collar billionaire. Yeah. What Mr. Kemper was saying about Steve Bannon and his rhetoric is exactly the case. These guys constantly pretend to care about middle Americans who have been ruined by, the last economic downturn, 30 years of growing inequality. Trump's speech at the Republican convention, for example, this was his greatest moment. The Republican convention was kind of a botch. I mean, I was there. It was a disaster. Everything went wrong, nothing worked. But Trump did a good job. He had actually rehearsed his talk, unusual for him, right? And he had actually rehearsed his talk, and he really meant to do a good job, and he did deliver. It was his high point of his campaign. And in his speech, he pledged himself to the working class voters left behind by the current recovery. And this is what he said: "I have visited the laid off factory workers and the communities crushed by our horrible and unfair trade deals." Now this next phrase is an exact echo of Franklin Roosevelt. "These are the forgotten men and women of our country, people who work hard but no longer have a voice." It's Trump saying that. Then he goes on and tries to reverse the traditional liberal criticism of conservatives as being puppets of the billionaire class, the Koch brothers and all that sort of thing. This is what Trump said: "Big business, elite media, and major donors are lining up behind the campaign of my opponent because they know she will keep our rigged system in place." Rigged system, he stole that, of course, from Elizabeth Warren. He goes on. Trump says, "They are throwing money at her," meaning Hillary, "because they have total control over every single thing she does. She is their puppet, and they pull the strings." You see what I'm getting at here, folks? Now, Donald Trump is a hypocrite and a vulgarian and a bigot. But when he said those things, he connected with people emotionally. When he said that the system is rigged, he's right. It is. When he said that huge parts of this country have been deindustrialized and that's a bad thing, yeah, he's right about that. And Democrats are always saying, "Oh, nothing you can do about that. That's globalization." And here's Trump saying, "No, we can do something about it." He has no idea what. Not a clue. Here's what drives me crazy, folks. Everything that he said in that speech, those are things that my side used to say. That's things that my team used to, that's how we used to talk. So where are the Democrats in all of this? Look, water. You know this. If you're as old as me, you remember that once upon a time, protecting the middle class society is what the Democratic Party was all about. This was the primary mission, and they never shut up about it. They reminded you of this every chance they got. And I can't help but think that if you take certain Democratic leaders of the past, and I know they all had their problems, but if you take someone like Franklin Roosevelt or Harry Truman, Lyndon Johnson, Hubert Humphrey, and you put them in today's situation, they would know exactly what to do about it. They would take one look at what Wall Street is doing to this country and doing to the world, and they would swing directly into action. But many of our modern Democratic leaders falter. They acknowledge that inequality is rampant and it's an awful thing, and they cry big, hot tears about it. But they cannot find the conviction or the imagination to do what is necessary to put this thing into reverse. And instead, they offer us the same high-minded policy platitudes that they have been dishing up since the 1980s. And they tell us, oh, dude, there's nothing anybody can do about technology, right? Nothing you can do about that. There's nothing anybody can do about globalization, right? Oh, no, not globalize. That is the hand of the Almighty, the invisible hand of God himself, reaching down into human affairs and rearranging our lives just however he sees fit. Nothing we can do about globalization, right? And so you know what they do. They offer us charter schools and job training, and yeah, they'll shovel out the student loans, right? But other than that, folks, they have got nothing. The example I want to focus on, the failure I want to focus on, is also from 2009. Like I said, I think that's the turning point for us. 2009, the same year the pundits were declaring the Republican Party to be dead. The issue is the Wall Street bailouts. This, I think, was the historical inflection point where our country and the entire world could have changed course. But we didn't do it. This was the turning point, folks, and we missed the turn. I want you to try to remember what it was like. Barack Obama was elected, had just been elected president in a tremendous wave of hope and enthusiasm, and I was one of the hopeful ones. And do you remember the rally he had here in Kansas City? Hundreds of thousands of people. The world believed in this man. The country believed in this man. And then he proceeded to continue the bailout policies of George W. Bush, essentially unchanged. No big banks got put into receivership. By the way, they put banks out of business in Kansas City all the time. It happens all the time, all over this country. But not Citibank. Not J.P. Morgan. Oh, no, 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 no. No bailouts got unwound. No elite bankers got prosecuted. Hell, they didn't even get fired. Obama did fire the CEO of General Motors. I thought he deserved it. I thought that was a good move. But no, 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 not those guys at Wells Fargo. Not the guys at Goldman. Of course not. Obama and his Democratic team refused to change course, folks, when every sign was telling them it was time to turn, when it would have been good for this country to turn, I mean healthy for this country to do something about financialization, when it was fully within their power at the time to make that turn. It's not anymore, by the way, but it was then because of the bailouts, when it would have been overwhelmingly popular to make that change. And lastly, when the country fully expected the president to turn. And when I say the country, I mean the Wall Street bankers themselves. Do you remember this moment almost exactly 8 years ago to the day? Barack Obama was brand new president, and he had the leaders of the Wall Street banks down to the White House, and they come down from Manhattan to Washington, and they go into their meeting with the president. And they're on their, and this is all on film, of course, and not the meeting itself, but them walking into the White House. And as they're walking in, you look at their faces, and they are ashen-faced because they know what's going to happen to them. He's going to pull a Franklin Roosevelt on them. He's going to give these guys a spanking, right? No. They come out 2 hours later, all smiles. They step up to the microphones, nothing changed. Instead, we foamed the runways for these guys, in the immortal phrase of Treasury Secretary Tim Geithner. We foamed the runway for these guys. Why? I want to get one thing out of the way really quickly. Barack Obama did not play the greatest issue of our time the way he did because the working class rose up to defend its pals on Wall Street. That is not what happened. He didn't do it the way he did because the presidency lacks sufficient power. Presidency, folks, is an enormously powerful office, as we are reminded every single day right now when we open up the newspaper in the morning and see what outrage Trump has committed overnight. What I want to suggest is that Barack Obama played this issue the way he did back in 2009 because that's how he wanted to play it. And we have to get our heads around that if we want to understand what has gone wrong with the Democratic Party. But in truth, saying that just pushes the problem back a step. Okay, why did he want to do it that way? And in truth, this doesn't start with Barack Obama. You want to understand why he acted the way he did, you have to go back to the 70s, the 80s, the 1990s. You have to do a little bit of digging in Democratic Party history. And back in those days, when I was young, the Democratic Party was engaged in a kind of civil war over who they were and what they stood for. And there were all these different factions in the Democratic Party back then, and they fought like cats and dogs. But there was one thing that they all agreed on. They fought over every imaginable thing, but they all came together around one issue, and that was that the Democrats had to turn away from the legacy of the New Deal with its fixation on working class people. Everything else was up for grabs, but that, they were absolutely certain about that. Had to turn away from the New Deal. And what Democrats had to embrace instead, they said, was the emerging post-industrial economy. And the people, and this is fascinating, folks, the people that the Democratic Party needed to identify itself with were the winners in this new economic order. The highly educated professionals who populate our innovative knowledge industries. And you know what I mean by professionals? The sort of classic professions, lawyers, doctors, clergy, architects, engineers, that sort of thing. These days, though, it's an enormous category. It includes everyone, basically everyone with an advanced degree. So I'm part of this group. PhDs who write derivative securities, mathematicians, biochemists who make prescription drugs. Fascinating thing about the professional class. As a demographic group, back in the 1950s, they were one of the most Republican groups in society, professionals were. By the 1990s, they completely changed sides, and they're one of the most democratic groups in the country. And the Democratic Party itself has gone with them. And that's who the Democratic Party is today. They are a class party. They're the party of a class, like in the 19th century in France or Austria or something like that. They're the party of a class. It's just not the working class. They're the party of highly educated professionals. Now, we know the Democrats have many other constituent groups, of course, minorities, women, and the young, among many others. But professionals are the ones who come first. They're the ones who sit in the front seat. They're the ones with their hands on the steering wheel, and the rest of us ride in back. It is the tastes and manners of the professional class that are always celebrated by liberal newspapers. You know. Okay, I need to stop talking about this. The foodie stuff, artisanal stuff, craft cocktails. Jesus Christ. Look, American liberalism started out in the 19th century as a populist movement. No question about that. But today it is something very, very different. It is a movement of the winners and the highly credentialed. Now, liberals have generated all of these flattering, these wonderful phrases to describe their favorite demographic group, the professional class, these terms of endearment. They call them the wired workers who will inherit the future. They're supposed to be a learning class that truly gets the power of education. And of course, they are a creative class. You're familiar with this one, right? You've heard the creative class. Think about that for a second. Creativity is the property of a class. It's the property of a really wealthy, high-achieving class. Isn't that just a beautiful thought? Furthermore, you have to organize your city around the needs and tastes and desires of this class. You have to write trade deals to make this class happy, or otherwise they'll move to like Denmark or something. You know, you got to bow down before the creative class. Sorry. And but by creative class, of course, I mean the same thing. It's always the professional class. And Democratic leaders, the leaders of the party are, of course, always drawn from the same group. You think about the life story of Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton. It has a very similar trajectory. All three of them were plucked from these obscure lives by a fancy school. Bill Clinton is this kid and teenager in Hot Springs, Arkansas. And he goes to Georgetown University. He becomes a Rhodes Scholar. He goes to Yale Law School. and the doors of the world open up for him. And you look at the people that that advise all three of these leading Democrats, and it's always these Ivy League people. The Washington Post used to periodically run these stories, marveling at Barack Obama's inner circle of advisors. They weren't just Ivy Leaguers. They all were from one institution. They all had some association with Harvard. Hell, he had the president of Harvard University advising him, Larry Summers, right? But then there are a handful that didn't have any connection with Harvard, and they had all gone to Oxford, in England. So this is the Democratic Party idea. Professionals are the heroes of history. Do you remember in Marx, it is the proletariat, this idea that you have at the end of history, this one class of people stands as the winners, the victors of history at the end of this dialectic. And for Marx, of course, it's the proletariat. But for the Democrats, they have a kind of similar theory, and the winner is the creative class. That's who stands at the end of this great dialectic of creativity and innovation. And this also happens to be the #1 constituency of the Democratic Party. And of course, the leaders of the party are always drawn from this exact same group. Do you see what I'm getting at here, folks? What I'm describing is a long-term shift of allegiance from the middle class, the working class, to professionals. And this explains everything, or really close to, well, hell, if you ask me, everything, every last little goddamn thing. This explains everything about the Democratic Party that is frustrating and disappointing and irritating and drives you absolutely crazy. Everything. I mean, how do you get a situation like we're in right now, where inequality is out of control, where we are headed back to a 19th century pattern of wealth distribution? Headed there. Hell, we are there, folks. The 19th century actually looks pretty damn good. Inequality is out of control, and the party of the left can't take advantage of this situation. How does that happen? How do you get in a situation like this where the middle class is disintegrating and the party of the left is in a state of historic defeat, where the middle class is coming apart and people are turning to a mountebank like Donald Trump, to solve their problems for them? This is only possible, folks, when the party of the left, and that's what the Democrats are in our system, this is only possible when the party of the left is not interested in its historic mission. That's the only way you get this combination of inequality and defeat. Why aren't they interested? Let's go back to that problem of the Democrats and the Wall Street banks. Why did the Democratic team back in 2009 fail to do what obviously needed to be done with the Wall Street banks? Why did they declare that Wall Street executives were going to be held to a different legal standard than ordinary criminals? And they did declare this. The guy who said it was a high official at the Justice Department. He had to resign as soon as it became public knowledge. But he said it, folks. Why did this administration choose Wall Street over average people again and again and again and again? Why? Because for the achievement-conscious people who made up the upper echelons of the administration, investment bankers were more than friends. These people were classmates. These people were peers. Hell, these people are the face in the mirror. The two groups are, you look at the Treasury Department and you look at investment bankers in New York, and they are demographically identical. They are the same. The Justice Department, J.P. Morgan. People go back and forth through the revolving door, and there is no difference. There is no change. The Democrats look at Wall Street and they see an industry filled with people of subtle minds and extraordinary innovation and sophisticated jargon. God, they love that jargon. Do you know what I'm talking about? So Wall Street made up a bogus professional jargon in order to shield themselves from outside scrutiny. Professions always do that, but in the case of Wall Street, it's complete bullshit, right? You know what I'm talking about? And the Democrats are like, dude, that's so sophisticated. Right? They look at Wall Street and they see financial wizards who are plucking wealth out of thin air, making these financial instruments that are so admirably complex, right? Slicing and dicing risk until it doesn't exist anymore. It's like financial rocket science, as one administration official said. And by the way, he said that as a way of explaining why they weren't prosecuting these guys. Financial rocket science. Dude, it's so complex, complexity, no one understands it. It is exactly the same for Big Pharma, of course. So innovative. You can't import generic pharmaceuticals from India or Canada. No. You have to protect these innovative companies. You have to protect Pfizer. And folks, mega dittos for Silicon Valley, an industry that can do no wrong in democratic eyes. I mean, so lovable, Mark Zuckerberg. So professional, ooh, Eric Schmidt. So creative, ooh, Jeff Bezos. That for this one industry, enforcement of our country's antitrust laws was basically suspended, just for this one industry. What does a party of the professional class believe in? The most important, you know the answer to this. It is meritocracy, of course. The number one item on the list is meritocracy, the idea that the successful deserve their rewards, and the people on top in our society are up there because, God damn it, they are the best. This is the first commandment of the professional class. Everyone gets what they deserve, and what they deserve is defined by how they did in school. So, you know, you're worried about inequality? Well, the only solution is to go to a really top-ranked university, right? So you look at that farmer out in Missouri watching his way of life blow away in the August wind, and they say, dude, you needed to go to MIT or something. Well, that's the answer. Folks, this is not, you see what I'm getting at? This is not a philosophy for tackling inequality or reducing inequality. This is a philosophy for rationalizing inequality, right? It's always your own fault. It relentlessly pushes the blame back onto you as an individual. The reason your life sucks is because you didn't get a gold star from your teacher in kindergarten. Or you didn't finish high school. Or maybe you did finish high school, and maybe you even went to college, but you didn't go to a good school, right? And maybe you did go to a good school, but you didn't study the right subject. You didn't study STEM or whatever the hell it is that they're pushing now. Or maybe you did study STEM, and 20 years from now, that will look like a stupid mistake too, you know? No one knows. But the idea, you've read Tom Friedman, right, in the New York Times. Endlessly, relentlessly push the blame back onto you as an individual. That's what inequality is. It is your own goddamn fault. What I am describing is a philosophy of winners. And the Democratic Party, the reason people hate the Democratic Party is it is a party of winners. That is our left party in this stupid system in this country today, a party of the new economy winners. I mean, there's a reason that poor Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign was all about her resume. And her resume looked pretty good. It was all about her credentials, and they were awesome. And she thought that she could win by running as a hyper-competent expert. Friends both with Wall Street bankers and the more enlightened sort of graduate students. The Democrats' unofficial slogan in this last go-round was, "America is already great." I mean, it's like something you would see inscribed on a country club logo somewhere, folks. It's complacency, but it's not just complacency. This is complacency on wheels. This is a kind of militant complacency. And of course, Hillary did really well with affluent suburban Republicans, and she did really well in prosperous college towns. And you look at a map of Missouri in the last go-round, and she won St. Louis and KC and Columbia, and that's it. And you look at all these other Midwestern states, and it's always the same. She wins the big cities, the college town, and folks, it is a wipeout everywhere else you go. And this is happening all over the world. Everywhere you go in the Western world, parties of the left are dispirited, and they don't know what they believe in any longer, and they spin the same stupid fantasies of globalization and innovation and the creative class. And everywhere you go, working people are abandoning these parties by the millions. And they are lining up with demagogues like Marine Le Pen and Donald Trump, who at least pretend to understand the situation they're in. As for this man Trump, I think he will make an almost perfect epitaph for the era of professional class liberalism. I mean, he is exactly the opposite of what the Democrats respect. He has, his government experience is, of course, zero. Hillary was the most experienced presidential candidate of all time. Trump was the least. We chose him. He holds expertise in contempt. He is noticeably indifferent to facts. I mentioned I live in Washington these days, and the household god of Washington is centrism, consensus, bipartisanship. You know what he thinks of that? He doesn't give a damn. He does not care about those things. This man is a human middle finger to the... to everything that makes up the sort of stately contemplation Washington Post vision of the presidency. Okay, so what is the right response to the age of Trump? Now, I know it is fun to enlist in the political wars, and I've done it for years, and it's a blast. And it's fun to talk about how stupid he is. I know this, and he seems, to me, he seems like an ignoramus, right? But every time I think that, I remember that we said the same thing about Ronald Reagan. And they used to put out these little books of Reagan's stupid quotations. Do you remember this? Reagan's Tall Tales, illustrated with photographs of Reagan looking stupid. And Reagan kicked our ass, folks. And they did the exact same thing with George W. Bush, these books of his dumb quotes. Here he is saying something stupid. Here's a picture of him looking stupid. He beat us too. And now this guy. I think it's also a mistake to scold his supporters for their cluelessness. I think it's a mistake to, and a lot of people are doing this, by the way, in Washington, to imagine that the political divide in America, the divide between the parties, that what it really is a divide between a party of righteousness and a party of sin, or a party of enlightenment and a party of ignorance. I don't think that's what it is. And I can't help but think, and this is the Kansan in me, but I can't help but think that the right answer to fake populism is the real deal. It's not to go around insisting on what good taste we have and what good manners we have, but to give people the real thing. To show those Trump supporters that we care about them a lot more than Donald Trump does. That yes, the system is rigged, and Donald Trump is one of the people that rigged it. Look, this is the Kansan in me. I think populism by itself is a very healthy thing. I think it's even a wholesome thing. A suspicion of elites, a hostility towards arrogance and aristocracy and hierarchy and privilege. These are healthy things. This is what living in a democracy is all about. This stuff is second nature. It ought to be second nature to us. And it's not hard to figure out the kind of populist issues that the Democratic Party could identify itself with that might both reverse inequality and bring Donald Trump voters back into the Democratic fold. I mean, here's one. Reindustrialization sounds pretty good. Enforcing antitrust again, you know, go on a crusade, that would be awesome. Some of Bernie Sanders' issues look pretty good. Universal health care, free college. How about making it easier to form a labor union in this country? All of these things would both, I've lost the last page. All of these things would both help to, you know, bring people back into the Democratic fold and do something about inequality. And here's the crazy thing. They're not radical ideas. Everything I just mentioned is, you know, standard issue Democratic populism from, you know, 1948 or something like that. Nothing radical about it at all. The problem is not coming up with issues. I mean, those issues that I just mentioned took me about 10 seconds to come up with. The problem is getting the Democratic Party to embrace those issues, okay? They will resist everything I just described with every fiber in their being. I mean, even after the debacle of last November, they have no interest in any of these things. They are resisting doing any of these things. Folks, we are going to have to drag them kicking and screaming to victory. And until the day that happens, we are going to bounce along in this country from government by one set of affluent people to government by a different set of affluent people, right? You're going to get your sort of centrist Clintonism that deregulates the banks, and then it yields to your authoritarian George W. Bush-ism, which deregulates the banks some more. and then inevitably screws up, and then the centrists get back in, and they inevitably fumble, and it goes to Donald Trump, and on and on and on. Folks, where is this all going to end? Only when we, the people, finally come back for our party. Thank you very much. Good way to end the book, too. All right, so we'll take some questions.
Take questions, and if you could come up to this microphone.
Right here, folks.
And
then
also, we're Rainy Day Books. Vivian and Roger are around the corner selling books, and Tom will sign the books. And Vivian and Roger wanted me to tell you that they are working class, not professional class booksellers.
And one other thing, I actually signed a big stack of them already. So if you've had enough, and I'm real close to that myself. This is, like I said, Dave, or stop number 14. I signed a whole bunch of them. If you don't want to wait for me to personalize it and everything. So there we go. All right, yes, sir.
So we're going to take a limited number of questions because.
But I'm not complaining. I can hack it.
Okay, good. Whatever you want.
One thing, I wish you would run for president, for one thing. Or at least come back here and run for governor.
Yeah.
You know, the interesting thing is...
By the way, have you seen my TV commercials with the machine gun? Have you seen that? With the...
The interesting thing is, you might not know, you probably do, but a lot of people here probably don't know, Kansas elected more Democrats in this last election, the legislature, than any other state in the nation.
Yeah.
Why? Because we have Brownback.
Brownback, yeah.
You know, I don't want him to go to Rome. I want him to still be here in the next election, so people forget very quickly.
Yeah.
But, you know, as a longtime party activist, I was the executive director of the Democratic Party in Kansas for a number of years. But we had a chance to reorganize. You know, we have a new leadership. Who would you have picked?
Oh,
Tom Perez is a nice guy, but he was not my
you're
pick.
talking about the national.
Yeah, the national. You know,
Perez is a nice guy. So you're asking about the DNC election.
Yeah.
So, I mean, this was unusual because people paid attention to it for one. This never happens, right? No one ever cares about this stuff. And a lot of the Bernie supporters were feeling pretty bad because they felt like the DNC had cheated in the last go-around. So they were very determined to get their guy, and their guy was Keith Ellison. I've met Keith Ellison. I really like him. I mean, that man is, you know, he's thoughtful, highly intelligent, young, and, you know, very eloquent. He is, and I mean, I've met a lot of Democratic politicians at the national level, and a lot of them really, they've got nothing on the ball, but this guy does. And he really is the future of the Democratic Party, and I think that they missed an opportunity by not choosing him. But by the same token, Tom Perez is not a bad guy. The larger question is the war within the Democratic Party, which I've just given you in a nutshell. And I want to say before I go on, everything I've said, and you guys, you're so gracious, and you apparently liked what I have to say. Nothing that I said is permissible in mainstream media, NPR, New York Times. I write for a British publication now. Remember how I used to be on MSNBC all the time? Do you remember this? I'm not anymore. You know why? This is why. This stuff is why. Everything I just said is not permissible in the debate in this country, in the public debate. But there is a debate going on in Washington among Democrats right now, and over the future of the party, over what direction to take. And the short form version of what it's about is accountability. This party has been on a downhill slide for, what is it, 30 years, 40 years. I mean, this is often hard for young people to understand. When I was a kid, the Democrats controlled Congress always, because they were the party of the people. They had this incredible brand image as the party of the working class, the party that defended the middle class. And they won, they controlled Congress always. And that's gone. We lost that in 1994, and we've never really got it back. They get it back from time to time. But this is, so that what I'm saying is the Democrats in Washington want to brush it off, say, you know, we were cheated by the Russians. Okay, fair enough, they were. We had this misfortune and that misfortune. Yes, that did happen. But this is a long-term picture, folks, a long-term slide. And this has to be addressed. It cannot go on. I'm going to give you one more reason why it has to be addressed. Because Trump, as I mentioned, is an ignoramus, or he seems like it. He also sometimes seems like a genius. I mean, how the hell did he beat the Clintons? This is the world's most powerful and best funded political machine, and he beat them. It's extraordinary. Okay, whatever happens to Trump, and he might get impeached, and he might resign, and he might step down and not run again in 4 years. Whatever happens to him, Trumpism is not going away. Trumpism, this combination of populism and nationalism, the Republicans have now seen something, how to beat the Democrats, okay? How to beat the sort of changing demographic thing that this problem that the Republican Party has been looking at for 20 years. Now they see how to beat it. It's Trumpism. And the next Trump is going to be someone that isn't quite as stupid as Donald Trump. It's going to be someone that knows you don't make fun of the handicapped when you're running for president. Someone that knows you don't, boast about, just walking up to strange women on the street and, groping them. Trump made so many elementary blunders. I still can't believe he won. The next Trump won't do that. It'll be someone smart like Marco Rubio or Ted Cruz. That's not going to make those mistakes. And it's going to be much harder to beat. So my warning to the Democratic Party is this is going to get worse, not better. And they're sitting around in D.C. expecting everything to, Trump is very unpopular right now. There's these huge protests, and all that is great. And the Democrats are saying, we don't have to change anything. We're just going to slide right back in. In 2 years, we'll get Congress again, and everything will be fine. Everything will be hunky-dory. No. They might win here and there. They might, it's absolutely true that they might win next time around. Trumpism is here to stay, and you better think of a way to beat it. Yes, sir.
With the amount of bankers and the enlightened folks that make up the two parties, what's the best way to go about forming a coalition of more middle-class people who come from both sides of the aisle to work together and tolerate each other to kind of take back the country from the elitists that currently run kind of everything?
Okay, great question. You're not suggesting a third party, are you? Or are you? Maybe you are.
No, but not just Democrats. They get people from...
Yeah, from both sides, because there's plenty of Republicans that can see what I'm talking about too. I mean, it's obvious, and I don't want to sound like I'm some kind of crazy left-winger, although most people think that's what I am, but one of the things that I noticed in this last go-round is how many Republicans liked Bernie Sanders. Did you notice this? So it was a weird thing. I have a very conservative friend back in D.C., and I forget who he chose in the Republican primary, but he really liked Sanders, and he hoped that the Democrats would nominate Sanders so that he could vote for him. And I've just been, on this tour, I've been in union halls all over the country, or all over the Midwest, I should say. Well, a couple of them anyways. And a lot of the rank and file in these unions went for Trump. But you should see these union halls. They always have pictures of Sanders in them. They loved that man. And there was something, in Washington he's regarded, and this is interesting now, they regard him as a crank. He calls himself a socialist, which is, I don't know why he does that, because if you ask me, what he's selling is reassuring, Truman-era Democratic policies, stuff that is, we've all seen before, that's not scary, that's not frightening, that's not radical. And to a lot of people, that's very reassuring. Now, he insists on, being an independent and calling himself a socialist and all that sort of thing, and the Democrats hate him. But there is, and the funny thing is that by Washington standards, he's way out there. He's the most popular politician in America today. Now, I don't think Sanders is going to run for president again. I think he's had his chance, but there's got to be somebody that can bring people together like that. And I don't know who it is, but I hope we find someone. Yes.
I'm afraid you kind of stole my question, but I'm just going to underline it rather than make the statement.
All right.
One of the things that this insanity that the left of center parties are engaged in here in America doesn't stop at our border. Great Britain has Tony Blair. France has this character, whoever's president of France, Hollande, I think it is.
Hollande, yeah.
Who's a left of center party, and he's turned in the working class in France.
Yep.
The north part of France used to be communist, is now going for Madame Le Pen.
Le Pen, yeah, that's
and then
exactly
you got Nigel Farage in England, who's crazy as they come. And is it not true that this seems to be a worldwide phenomenon?
Yes.
We're not the only country that needs a straitjacket.
That is exactly right. That is exactly right. This is happening everywhere.
Happening everywhere.
I've been in a lot of those countries. Just in this last book tour, I was also in Australia, and they have the thing is, we're considerably farther down this road than everyone else. So you mentioned Tony Blair a second ago. One of the really interesting things is that when Bill Clinton appeared to be a success in the 90s in this country, and Bill Clinton is the central figure in Listen Liberal, he's sort of the great turning point. But when he appeared to be a success in America in the 90s, left of center parties all over the world started imitating what he did. And you mentioned Tony Blair in England, but the French imitated him. He's imitated all over the place. And so all over the world, or the Western world anyway, you have these, like what used to be social democratic parties that are now photocopies of Clintonism, this third way stuff, move to the center stuff, austerity. They're all really into austerity. They're really into cutting away at the welfare state. These are parties of the left now, and they are being demolished. I mean, if you saw the results from the Netherlands a while ago, it was supposed to be great because Wilders, the right-wing candidate, didn't win altogether. But the Social Democrats, this is the party that built post-war Europe. They got wiped out. This is happening everywhere. So, the story is always the same. They don't know what they believe in. It's all this crap about innovation in the creative class, and they can't walk their way out of this sort of this trap that they're in. Where was I going to go with this? So the Australians had another thing that they were very worried about is, they're worried about this coming there. And it was actually very interesting. You remember you guys read What's the Matter with Kansas? I said that at the very end of the book, in some perverse way, we always think of Kansas as a backwater. As the last people to get, they still drive Trans Ams and, whatever. But still listen to, classic rock and all that sort of thing out in Wichita. But I said, but in some weird way, they're actually first. They're actually the innovators. In some ways, they are the first. And I went to Australia, and they were like, oh my God, you in Kansas. They were all reading What's the Matter with Kansas. They're like, you went through all of this stuff 20 years ago, and now we're having it here. It's crazy. Yes, it's happening everywhere.
As I listened to you, I felt increasing urgency about some of the things that Republicans are doing to set in stone some of the gains they've made. And I was thinking about the gerrymandering of congressional districts, the closing of the polls. And something that I don't know if it's on the radar yet or not, but the Koch brothers are financing a drive to a constitutional convention in which they want to pass a balanced budget constitutional amendment and so forth.
No.
And they have, I believe they are 6 states short presently of the 34 that they will need to
get the amendment.
To call the convention. After that, they need 4 more for 38 states.
Yeah.
And it's my understanding that their strategy is to gather the 38 first, have the convention, run through what changes they want to the Constitution, all in a stroke.
Yeah.
Do you see that as an imminent threat?
I've never heard that before, but it somehow doesn't surprise me.
They do have.
So, the larger issue of do you remember in I wrote a book called The Wrecking Crew, which now, also seems like this is like Donald Trump's manual. He comes to Washington and he's like, oh, that's what I should do, And, it's like them demolishing federal agencies. And they had this, one of their, I was studying the history of the right wing, and there was Jack Abramoff and his friend Grover Norquist, back in the 80s had all of these great ideas. And one of the things that I think it was Abramoff used to say was that the duty of every revolution is to make permanent its gains. And this is in the Reagan days. And you're exactly right that they come up with ways of setting their revolution, what they've won, their gains, setting them in stone. They're very ingenious at this. And there's people in Washington, this is their job, is to come up with these things. Now, I have not heard of the Constitutional Convention. The one that always scared me was Social Security privatization, which would, if they get that, I mean, the transition costs of going to a privatized system are so enormous that no country can incur them twice. And once they do it, it's gone. Social Security, everybody is then turning your money over to Wall Street to manage. This is obviously an incredible, windfall for the people in New York City, and it really sucks for the rest of us. But that's the big one, because they understand that Social Security that's what props up the rest of the welfare state. It's by far the most popular government program in this country ever. And if you can demolish that, if you can take that apart and turn it over to the private sector, you can wreck everything. You go right down the list. But that's by far the most popular one, the oldest one, the one that's been going longest. But I have not heard of the example you quote. But it doesn't surprise me that they would try something like that.
I would urge you just to Google the phrase Koch brothers Constitutional Convention, and it will set your hair on.
But the balanced budget amendment, that is frightening. I mean, that's just disaster on a plate, folks. That's horrible.
That would instantly destroy Medicare and Social Security.
That's it. Yeah, you're exactly right. Yeah, 19th century, here we come.
Well, first off, thanks for coming to Kansas City for this.
Of course. Come on now.
You can count on one hand the number of states that have Democrats in the governor's mansion, the state senate, and the state legislature.
Yeah. How many is it, like 6?
It's about 5, I think, and they're all either on the east or west coast.
Yeah.
Republicans, however, have that triage in about 25 to 30 states, including Missouri and Kansas. To me, and I don't know if you agree with this, but if the Democrats are going to avoid extinction, they've got to figure this out, how to get elected at the state level.
Yeah.
Congress would be great, but it has to start at the state level. And this is what the Republicans figured out a long time ago. They have had a farm system starting at the state level, and they elevate themselves to Congress and then the Senate. My question is, how important do you think the Democrats need to adopt that?
Well, yeah, but of course. However, the Democrats don't adopt anything. The Republican system is all built outside their party. Somebody mentioned the Koch brothers. That's just one of many different funding and organizing groups. Washington is filled with these groups. You got to remember something about the Democratic Party. They don't trust people like me. They don't trust a lot of. They're not interested in the kind of everything I just described tonight. They're not interested in that. They're interested in what they have. And by the way, I should just say, this has frustrated me my entire adult life, is the complacency of the Democratic Party. One of the points of beginning of Listen Liberal was when I was at a dinner party, and it was someone explained to me the theory of the coalition of the ascendant. Do you know what this is? This is the idea that demographic changes are taking place in America, and Democratic voters are a growing group, and Republican voters are a shrinking group. And the idea is that everyone votes their demographics, and that they can be counted on to do that forever, and you don't have to persuade anyone, and you don't have to do anything differently, and you don't have to serve anyone. It's just demographics are going to deliver up victory for you, and you don't have to do anything. And this is the strategy of the Democratic Party. And it's massively stupid, because it overlooks one huge thing, which is the Republicans aren't going to just take defeat lying down. They're going to do something about this. They are a dynamic group, and they're going to dream something up, and look at Trump, he just did it. Okay.
You mentioned you mentioned the 1890s and the 1930s, the period when the Democrats, coalesced. 2009 was different. How much do you think how much of a factor do you think that right-wing media has played
It's
in the
enormous.
role?
It's an enormous factor. Let me keep going, though.
Because Fox News and Rush Limbaugh, as far as I'm
it's
concerned,
huge.
they are the de facto leaders of the Republican
of
Party.
course. So if you this came when I was writing What's the Matter with Kansas, and I was thinking about what the hell has happened to the left. You know, Wichita, Kansas, for example, is a union town, very blue-collar place, used to elect Democrats to Congress. Remember Dan Glickman? And what the hell happened there? And you go to that place, and it's like any other place in America. People have a lot of grievances with the world. They're pissed off about the Operation Rescue changed everything. But why? One of the things that I came to is that when you have all these beefs with the world, you're angry at the world about this, you're angry at the world about that. In a place like that, you turn on the radio and instantly you have an explanation. And a man taking your anger and speaking to your anger and acknowledging your anger and saying your anger is legitimate. And by the way, it's liberals' fault. These liberals, anyhow, it's extraordinary. And this culture is everywhere in America now. And so if you have a beef, if you're an aggrieved person, if you're an angry person, they have an answer for you. And it's everywhere. It's very easy. You turn on the radio and there it is. And I was like, well, what happened to the liberal answer? Because, of course, there used to be a liberal answer. It's gone. It was in things like labor unions, news, and their newsletters, and their, farm organizations, all of these different groups. And these are dead. They're gone. I want to say one more thing about the Democrats and their incredible complacency. And that is, so I wrote the story that Mr. Kemper referred to my story about Marceline, Missouri. So I went in, to northern Missouri and was looking at some of these areas. And you know what Missouri is not just a democratic state, or once upon a time was not just a democratic state, but a profoundly democratic state. And these are people that have shrines to Harry Truman in their houses and that love Harry Truman, And you go out there now and these counties went for Trump by 70%, 80%. I mean, it's an incredible blowout. And you go back to 2008, and it was much closer. In fact, Obama actually won a lot of farm counties in Iowa, Wisconsin, lots of farm counties. Okay, so now these counties are totally gone to the Democrats. They went for Trump by this enormous percentage. And by the way, not because they're rich people. These towns are crumbling. I mean, look at these towns, and it makes you cry. It's an awful thing. Their buildings are literally falling apart. Okay. And now they're lost to Trump. So the Democratic Party looks at this happening, this change from 2008 to the present. And what's their response? So there's a group called the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. And there's a story about what they're doing about basically the destruction of their membership in places like Missouri, all over the Midwest. What are they going to do about it? There's a story about them in the Washington Post. And you know what their answer is? They look at counties like the ones I just described, and their answer is walk away. Spend your resources somewhere else. Try to win in the cities. Forget about those people. That's the Democratic Party. These people have an enormous problem with actually reaching out to the middle class and working class people that used to be their base. And I think in some ways it's psychological, There's something wrong with these guys. We'll talk about that some other time, okay? Yes.
One of the concerns I have, I look at this crowd here, and I don't know that there's a 20-year-old in here.
Oh, come on. There's got to be. Yes, back there. They're back there. Yeah.
But look at the percentage of them.
I know.
You understand where I'm going with this?
Yeah.
We're not seeing the group that needs to be here because they're the ones that are going to get it in the end in the next 20, 30, 40 years. They're not here. Why?
I know it. It's a book reading. I know. It's a problem. It drives me crazy. It drives me crazy, but this is my stupid, degraded form that I work in. It's books. Now,
let me finish the question.
Okay.
Being a wordsmith, you're familiar with Frank Lutz.
Frank Luntz, the pollster?
Thank you. And I don't know how many people here know his impact and his ability to turn a phrase and how it's affected many elections, maybe even on a national scale. If you were to be Frank Lutz for the Democrats right now, what would be your phrase, your message, one message that the Democratic
Party... Okay, so somebody's
Party...
finally stumped me.
The Democratic Party could fall under that banner
Oh, man.
and take them on, because it's going to be all about the words
Yeah.
and the wording.
Yeah, yeah.
And he's an expert at it.
I don't know the answer to that. I think that my idea is a movement building. My idea is that you have to build, it's not just the phrasing. That's important, of course. It's not just the messaging, it's building a movement. And you know, the movements, and look, the Democrats have allowed a lot of their own movements to die. Movements, God, here's the hilarious thing. You know how I know about social movements? Because I studied them in graduate school. It's so bad. I mean, it's everywhere, right? The professional bacillus, whatever. But that's how change happens in American life. You build a movement, and the movement sweeps on to victory. And we saw that even with something as fake and phony as the Tea Party movement. It had achieved these extraordinary results. But the Democrats have, you know, the most important movement to them was, of course, organized labor once upon a time. And it was almost a point of pride for, like, the Clinton wing of the Democratic Party to not just betray organized labor, but to actively injure organized labor, which they did. And to constantly, they love to take their money, which they do every 4 years, take the money of the unions, and then refuse to help them in any way. But that said, I mean, the problem is much bigger than that. There's a lack of imagination and a lack of daring and a failure to take chances or to be imaginative about anything. A slogan: freedom plus groceries. Okay, I didn't make that up, but it's a good one. It's an old one from the 30s.
Could Elizabeth Warren pull that off?
Oh, hell yes, she's great. She's awesome. She's one of my heroes, Elizabeth Warren. She's from Oklahoma. Did you guys know this? So I did debate in high school, and here at, you know, Shawnee Mission East, and she did debate at her high school in Oklahoma, and she is, I met her, and she's like this instantly recognizable personality type, right? I know you. I mean, I've never met her before, right? But she's the best. Yes, yeah.
The Democratic Party's been talked about a lot tonight, and I'm going to take advantage of the age of this group to offer this observation.
All right.
The Democratic Party is soylent green. It's made up of people, and there's a war raging within the Democratic Party.
Yes.
I got elected to the DNC from Missouri last June 18th as part of the Bernie Sanders movement in Missouri. Yes. I got to vote for Keith Ellison twice, but I got to meet Tom Perez and was very impressed with him. And the best candidate by far was Pete Buttigieg.
Is that right?
So he's coming.
Okay.
He's coming on. But I just want to say that I got elected to the DNC. My wife and I were also elected committee man and committee woman for Blue 7 and independence. And the way you change the Democratic Party and the way the populists win the war within the Democratic Party, the advice comes from a book that I don't think has been published yet, The Wit and Wisdom of Chris Christie. This is the entire book as far as I know. If we want our ideas to matter, we have to win elections.
Yeah.
Because if we don't win, we don't govern, and if we don't govern, all we do is shout into the wind.
Yep, fair enough.
So we need to run as committee men and committee women, and then we elect everybody else in the Democratic Party from that point up. It's built for a grassroots revolution.
Yeah. Do you remember in What's the Matter with Kansas is a similar story about within the Republican Party in Kansas, where you had this group of working class people in Wichita and places like Shawnee, and they overthrew the party of Dwight Eisenhower and Bob Dole and Nancy Kassebaum from the bottom up. And you know, when I was writing that story, it was like kind of inspiring. These guys did this with very few resources, almost nothing. A lot of these guys were working class guys, and they, I mean, overthrew some of the, you know, wealthy, very wealthy, you know, interests in Kansas. Of course, it has a terrible ending, named Brownback.
Right.
But it's an inspiring story, and it proves it can be done. Can I say one more inspiring thing?
Yes.
Or maybe a horrifying thing. For years, we have been told that our principles have to be sold out because of money. That was the sort of mantra of the Clinton wing of the Democratic Party. We will sell you out at every turn, and we'll move to the center, and you know, we're not going to advocate for your issues, but we can raise the money and we can win office. Well, Hillary, she did that, right? She outspent Donald Trump, the billionaire. She outspent the billionaire 2-1, and he won. It's incredible. And Bernie Sanders, here he comes with no resources at all, and he did a really good job. He did it incredibly well in the Democratic primary. There's all sorts of amazing things. None of the old rules apply anymore, folks. That is a great thing.
And there's one other kind of election we can win, not in Kansas, sadly, but in Missouri we have ballot initiatives.
Yes.
I've filed 11 so far this year, and we're pushing 5 of them through a website called governmentbythepeople.org. We just started collecting signatures 2 nights ago, and we will be collecting signatures. If we get enough signatures by May 6th of 2018, we can put all sorts of things on the ballot in November of 2018.
Okay. One more, okay?
So.
Oh, okay, all 3 of you guys, but that's it, all right? I'm sorry that you waited so long, and thank you for your patience. Okay.
About 3 years ago, Robert Kennedy Jr. spoke at UMKC, and I think 25 people showed up. I was one of them. And he was very passionate, and he spoke for 90 minutes straight. And he was talking about corporations and the environment and getting the correct information to people. But in the end, he said, it's very difficult because 90% of the Republicans are bought and sold, and 70% of the Democrats are bought and sold.
Yes.
And I'm really wondering, now we see with all the campaign money, with the big money, with dark money.
Yeah.
It's really hard. I mean, I think one of the reasons Brownback is in Kansas is because of the Koch brothers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Of course, and
So
others. I mean, there's lots of different players in this game.
So I guess I'm asking at this point, since it's such a free-for-all, and since there is such, I mean, a lot of people in what's left of the middle class are just trying to survive.
Yeah.
How do you fight these incredible forces?
Can I just say, look, I want to be positive about this. This is not did everybody hear the question? It's like, what do you do about big money in politics? And I just mentioned the hopeful sign, which is how crazy it is that this year the loser outspent the winner 2-1. I mean, and there's all sorts of reasons for that. But it reminds me of, I referred to the 1890s earlier, and it wasn't a particularly good time for the Democratic Party, but William Jennings Bryan was outspent something like 20-1. This used to happen all the time. Franklin Roosevelt was always outspent, massively outspent. He won 4 times. The reason Harry Truman did his famous whistle-stop campaign in 1948, and I learned this at the Truman Library, by the way, the reason he did that was because he didn't have any money. He couldn't afford, here's Tom Dewey flying around the country, right, in a fancy airplane. And poor Harry Truman, all he could do was get this train, and he's riding around the country on the back of a train. And the Democrats have always been outspent, always. But in those days, they had a different way of winning, which is, they have the money and we have the numbers. We have the people behind us. And the Democratic Party abandoned that idea in the 1980s and 1990s on the altar of money because, they said we have to match the Republicans dollar for dollar with our fundraising. And that was the whole, one of the great principles of Clintonism. But this election has shown that that is not necessarily what you need. The world is wide open now. I mean, yes, the money in politics drives me crazy. And Washington is the richest city in America, and that's a conversation for another time. The way money sloshes around in that city, it's incredible. But there's so much more to it. And there are tools out there now. And we're going to win this fight, damn it. Yes, ma'am.
My view is that world population is beyond sustainability already, and it, with very few voices, at least that I hear, is continuing in that direction towards further unsustainability. Combine that with the global temperature change, global warming, however you want to call it, which, in the context of this discussion tonight, do you have any comments about those things, that thing intertwined?
Global warming and population. Global population growth and everyone armed. How about that? And then no, sorry. Well, look, that is obviously the question of the survival of the human species also hangs over us these days, and we've got to snap into action. There's no question about that. And when I talked about reindustrialization, which I only mentioned in passing, obviously the place where you want to spend your money is on, green jobs and green energy and that sort of thing. That is clearly the road ahead. Unfortunately, we're going in the opposite direction now as fast as we can. So, I'm sorry. Yes, ma'am.
Well, when you talked to begin with, you said we can't lump all these Trump people into a basket that says they're deplorables, which I totally agree. But I'm asking you about how you are grouping elitists. I mean, you referred to the Franklin Roosevelt, antitrust is Teddy Roosevelt. They were very at the top. They were elitists.
You mean
so do you think they're different today? The elitists are all, there's no Franklin Roosevelt or Teddy Roosevelt?
Because they were from the elite. That is exactly right.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to tell you an anecdote, and this is my last one. Okay? Last anecdote. Then we're going to sign books and drink beer. Or whatever it is that we got. Okay. So, the Roosevelts were like aristocracy. The interesting thing, I mentioned one of the points of beginning of Listen Liberal, but there's another one, which was I met Barack Obama. He was my state senator in Chicago. I lived in Hyde Park. And I thought he was the greatest man in the world. I met him at a house party. And he's incredibly smart, obviously articulate, as we all know. He is gifted. He is the most gifted orator of our time. And I was so excited when he became president because I had written a book about George W. Bush and his team of hacks and cronies and how they had run everything into the ditch. And here comes Barack Obama, a professor at the University of Chicago, a brilliant man. And I knew one thing for sure about him is that he would hire the smartest people and put them in charge of these government operations. And we would show those Republicans how government could work when you put people who believe in it in charge. And I really thought that. I thought that he was the Franklin Roosevelt of my generation. And I was so excited when he became president. And he goes in there, and yes, he did put in the smartest people. He put in the president of Harvard, Larry Summers, in charge of the economy. And the rest is history. And it's all the other guys as well. And they proceeded, as I mentioned in the talk, in many ways to continue the policies of the Bush administration and to do other, various other things and to disappoint across the board. And so that really puzzled me. So I said to him, maybe my entire theory is wrong, and maybe, experts shouldn't be in charge of government. And there's, of course, what do? I study history whenever I'm faced with a problem like that. Turns out there's a great book on this subject about another example of government by expert. It's called The Best and the Brightest. David Halberstam, you've probably had him here at the library. I mean, he's gone now, but back in the day. And it's a book about the Vietnam War and how we got into that war and how it kept going against, when everyone was telling the administration back in Washington, this is a stupid war, you need to stop. And the answer is the exact same thing that I said tonight. It's the professional class refusing to acknowledge evidence from outside their class barriers. Right? So the people advising him were, again, these Harvard guys, the chairman of the political science department at Harvard advising Lyndon Johnson and, running the war with a computer. And people come to him and say, this war is stupid, this war is a disaster. And he's like, where's your PhD? And so then I'm like, after I read that, I'm like, damn, maybe government by expert, it never works. Is there an example when it does work? There is one. Franklin Roosevelt's administration. The famous Brains Trust, okay? And Roosevelt brought all these smart people in, and they pulled the country out of the Depression, and they won World War II. And these were experts, and these were smart people, okay? So then I'm like, well, what's the difference between those guys and Obama's team? And once you start looking up their biographies, the answer, it jumps out at you instantly. They're not all Harvard guys. He didn't just choose the chairman of all the different departments at Ivy League schools. That's not what Roosevelt did. He chose brilliant people from every walk of life, from all over America. Harry Truman was a brilliant man who didn't go to college. Roosevelt's attorney general, Robert Jackson, who later was on the Supreme Court and was the lead prosecutor at Nuremberg, was a lawyer with no law degree. You go right down the list. Harry Hopkins, his right-hand man during World War II, was a social worker from Iowa. Henry Wallace, who was the greatest ag secretary we've ever had in this country, before he became Secretary of Agriculture, ran a magazine for farmers. The man who Roosevelt put in charge of the Federal Reserve, a man called Mariner Eccles, was a genius, invented Keynesianism without having ever read Keynes, came to it entirely on his own. And this is where all the deficit spending of the New Deal came from. This guy dreamed it up. He was a small-town banker from Utah. The head of Roosevelt's bailout agency was a banker from Houston, Texas. Hated Wall Street. The man absolutely hated. You go right down the list. Even Roosevelt's Ivy Leaguers, and he had a bunch of them, were not orthodox thinkers. John Kenneth Galbraith, this is a man who spent his entire life fighting against what he called conventional wisdom. Or Francis Perkins was a labor organizer. Or Thurman Arnold, his trust buster, was a professor at Yale, but he wrote this incredible book called The Folklore of Capitalism. It's like the kind of book that ends your career nowadays. He writes something like that, you know. But this guy was great, and he was a genius, but he was... So when you choose the chairman of the department, you are getting orthodoxy. When you choose all your guys from Harvard, you're not only getting orthodoxy, you're getting people who are representatives of a class. And they will show class solidarity with other members, other people who are at the same professional rank as themselves. And this happens again and again and again and again and again in American life. There's hundreds of examples of it. And there's all sorts of ways. Look, I know a whole lot about professional economics. I'm not going to tell you why I know right now. But I went to the University of Chicago. I know a whole lot about professional economics. And when you tell me you're going to hire the best academic economists in America, I know instantly that you're going to get really shitty advice. You know, you're going to get... Because that's the nature of the beast. That is how professional economics works, and that's how political science works, and that's how every other one of these disciplines works. And Barack Obama made those choices. And you know, it's a lost opportunity, it's a missed opportunity. But anyhow, now we know the answer. Thank you so much for coming. Let's sign some books.